Good evening, friends, and welcome. Your presence here illustrates the triumph of disarmament over hockey. You're brave Canadian souls to come out and on this night, but we're very happy that you are, and welcome to this installment of the CIGI Signature Lecture Series. And I have a very deep pleasure in inviting Ambassador Jayantha Dhanapala to Canada, back to Canada, back to Waterloo, in fact, which he's visited here a few times, and to this podium. His visit, as you know, is sponsored jointly by CIGI and Project Plowshares, and he brings with him an extraordinary CV. And it's hard to know where to begin, but those of you who are even somewhat familiar with the vagaries of multilateral nuclear arms control and disarmament efforts will know that this is really the natural place to start. Over a remarkable public service career, one that remains in full swing, I might add, Mr. Dhanapala has been at the center of some of the key moments of nuclear disarmament challenges and successes in our era. A Sri Lankan diplomat, Ambassador Dhanapala, has been widely and rightfully acclaimed for his presidency of the 1995 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. For those of you who don't have the good fortune and sometimes misfortune of following nuclear diplomacy in detail, it's important to know that the 1995 NPT Review Conference was an event of monumental importance, really, literally deciding whether the treaty that had for 2.5 decades been the legal foundation for nuclear disarmament work would survive or disintegrate. As you can imagine, it was deeply divisive, hotly contested debate, but keeping it all on track and guiding the process forward to a landmark agreement was, of course, Ambassador Dhanapala. The 1995 Review Conference agreed to the permanent extension of that treaty and to a set of key decisions on disarmament principles. In addition to his careful and persistent diplomacy, Jayantha is also recognized internationally as a leading thinker and policy innovator in the disarmament community. The author of 4 books and a variety of journal articles, his wisdom and analysis, coupled with his deeply held personal commitment, have been sought for a succession of major international commissions and studies on nuclear disarmament, including the Canberra Commission, as well as the International Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission, led by Hans Blix. Ambassador Dhanapala was at the helm of multilateral disarmament diplomacy as United Nations Undersecretary-General for Disarmament Affairs. Before that, he directed the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. He's a former chairman of the UN University Council, a member of the governing board of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and far too many other international boards and organizations to mention here. As you might expect, he has received many honorary degrees and many other awards and international citations. And that is just his work on nuclear disarmament, the subject of tonight's talk. Ambassador Dhanapala could talk on a variety of other topics, and in each case, one could cite a long list of relevant involvements and accomplishments. Unfortunately, there isn't time to recount his many other involvements, although it is important to note that he was heavily involved in the peace process in Sri Lanka and through the UN and other peace processes. He worked internationally in support of the development of the Millennium Development Goals, and as a Sri Lankan diplomat, he served in diplomatic postings in London, Beijing, Washington, New Delhi, and the UN in Geneva. Mr. Dhanapala is definitely not a stranger to Canada, as I was saying, having served as the Simons Visiting Professor in International Law and Human Security, and at the School of International Studies at Simon Fraser University. And some of you who were at the book launch for Canada Among Nations last week will recall that he's also the author of a chapter in that volume. As I say, I wish I could go on talking about the work of this global public servant's extraordinary work as a part of the NGO disarmament community. I know firsthand about Ambassador Dhanapala's consistent recognition of the important work of NGOs internationally in fostering disarmament. One last thing I want to draw to your attention is the post that brings him on this visit to Canada, namely his role as president of Pugwash. Pugwash is Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs. It's an international organization named after the village of Pugwash, Nova Scotia, brings together scholars and policymakers to address a variety of issues, including disarmament concerns. Pugwash received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1995 for its efforts on disarmament, and our guest this evening is the 11th person to hold the position of president of Pugwash, following in the footsteps of the founder, Bertrand Russell, and a number of other notables, including Sir Joseph Rotblat, who received the Nobel Prize for disarmament. Ladies and gentlemen, we're privileged to have him here, and I invite you to join me in welcoming Jayantha Dhanapala.
Adlai Stevenson, the well-known US politician who took to diplomacy rather late in life, once said that there are three ingredients in the life of a diplomat: protocol, alcohol, and geritol. I'm at the geritol stage of my career as a diplomat, and I'm surprised that I'm still invited to speak at gatherings like this. But I'm very deeply grateful to those generous words of introduction from Ernie, a long-standing friend from Pugwash, and also for this opportunity to be here with CIGI in Waterloo, where I have been twice before, and to whose publications I have contributed chapters, the most recent being the new book that was only launched last week, where I was presumptuous enough as a non-Canadian to write about Canadian policy on arms control and disarmament. And I'm glad that I'm still welcome here in spite of my rather critical remarks about some aspects of Canadian policy. As Ernie has told you, I am here as president of the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, which is a distinguished international grouping of scientists and others who work for the cause of nuclear disarmament and peace and security internationally. And what is so distinctive about Pugwash is that it was born on Canadian soil. In 1957, when 22 scientists from all over the world gathered at the invitation of Cyrus Eaton in his Thinker's Lodge in this obscure fishing village in Nova Scotia. And ever since then, this movement has gathered momentum and has spread far and wide over 50 countries, working for the noble cause of the elimination of nuclear weapons, bearing in mind the words of the manifesto of Albert Einstein and Bertrand Russell, which came out in 1955, which said, "Remember your humanity and forget the rest." And so we carry a humanist message. We work for a cause which recently has been taken up by the first African-American president of the United States of America, Barack Obama. And we hope that this opportunity, this great moment that has come for the international community to seize in order to achieve a nuclear weapon-free world, will in fact be used by the international community to achieve precisely what we in Pugwash have been working for several decades, and which helped us to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1995. I think it's useful for us to remind ourselves of the global context which we face with regard to nuclear weapons. Quite apart from the fact that global military expenditure today is at the staggering level of $1,464 million, of which the United States accounts for 41.5%, there is also the astounding fact that 20 years after the Cold War ended, we have 23,300 nuclear warheads in the world among 9 countries. Now, what is also frightening is that over 8,000 of those are deployed, many of them on launch and warning status, which means at a moment's notice, all of us could be victims of a nuclear exchange, because we know that the launch of a nuclear weapon can obliterate entire cities, as President Obama said recently in his Prague speech, and that this use of nuclear weapons could cause incalculable climate change, a problem which we are all confronted with. We have, of course, had recently the negotiation of a New START treaty between the 2 nuclear giants, which together possess over 95% of the nuclear weapons in the world. But this brings their nuclear weapons, their strategic warheads deployed to 1,550. But the reduction of these nuclear weapons, I must clarify, does not mean destruction of any weapons. All that has happened is that they moved them from their deployed status to their non-deployed status, parked in a garage somewhere in the United States and in the Russian Federation. So this is not, in my view, genuine disarmament. It is arms control by another name, because at some stage in the future, we may have those weapons brought back into deployed status. What we require is actual destruction of nuclear weapons. And when you have 23,300 nuclear weapons all told, you are still facing a catastrophic nuclear destruction of the world, which will be the use of weapons many times the lethality of those weapons that were used in 1945 in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki. The fact that we have not had the use of nuclear weapons since then does not really give a tribute to the restraint of nuclear weapon states. But it is, as Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense, has told me personally, a matter of sheer luck. And we cannot depend on luck for the future survival of humankind. And so we have today more than the 5 nuclear weapon states within the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We have Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea as nuclear weapon armed states outside the NPT, without any of the restraints that the NPT has on nuclear weapon states. Not that those restraints have meant very much to the 5 nuclear weapon states within the NPT. Now, what is important for us to realize is that the threat of the use of nuclear weapons is very much interconnected with the other huge threat that we face internationally, and that is the threat of climate change. The term nuclear winter was coined in the 1980s by scientists to describe the climatic effects of a nuclear war at the time of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. It referred to widespread climate cooling caused by massive quantities of aerosol particles thrust into the atmosphere by the use of nuclear weapons. Today, more recently, studies conducted in 2007 and 2008 by Professors Brian Toon and Alan Roebuck of the University of Colorado and Rutgers show the following climate effects of nuclear conflict. A minor nuclear war, such as a regional conflict between India and Pakistan or in the Middle East, with each country using 50 Hiroshima-sized atom bombs as yabas on urban areas, could produce climate change unprecedented in recorded human history. This is only 0.03% of the explosive power of the current global arsenal. You can imagine then what it would be like if more nuclear weapons were used. I do not want to belabor the point, but this same scenario would produce global ozone depletion because of the heating of the stratosphere, and it would enhance chemical reactions that destroy ozone. A nuclear war between the United States and Russia today, or even after the reductions planned according to the earlier treaty that was signed when Bush was in power, it could produce a nuclear winter with temperatures plunging below freezing in the major agricultural regions, threatening the food supply of most of the planet. Now, a lot of us assume that the problem of the custody of nuclear weapons and nuclear facilities is a problem for developing countries only. It's a problem for Pakistan, where you have a very disorderly situation internally. The Taliban are waiting to put their hands on nuclear material and nuclear weapons. But even in the United States, with the most sophisticated way in which they have for the custody of their nuclear weapons, there have been accidents, which only goes to prove my point that today we run the risk of a nuclear weapon being exploded by design, hostile intent on the part of a nuclear weapon state against another state, or by accident. And secondly, by the actions of a nuclear weapon state or by a non-state actor, a terrorist group such as Al-Qaeda, who have been known to be actively searching for nuclear weapons to be used for their own nefarious purposes. Let me give a few examples of these nuclear near misses. We know, of course, of the most famous, the Cuban Missile Crisis, where both sides were quite blind to the actual imminence of the use of nuclear weapons. And again here, Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense at the time, has compared notes with his former Soviet counterparts in Moscow, and they realized how fortunate the world was to have avoided a nuclear holocaust as a result of sheer luck. In January 1995, a US scientific probe sent out to investigate the Northern Lights was mistaken by the Russian military technicians as a US missile launched from a submarine off the coast of Norway. And Russian officials were ready to respond with a nuclear reprisal until the rocket was considered no threat to Russia as a result of a last-minute exchange of information. More recently, 24 radioactive fuel rods fell from a crane and crashed onto a concrete floor in a nuclear reactor in Scotland, where this belonged to the United Kingdom. In 2007, in UK again, alarm systems designed to detect an impending nuclear accident at Britain's nuclear weapon factory were disabled for 10 days because of floods. So if anything happened during those 10 days, there was no way in which the siren would have been sounded. More recently again, in the mid-Atlantic, two nuclear weapon-armed submarines belonging to friendly NATO allies, the United Kingdom and France, collided, despite all the sophistication of the navigational equipment that you have today on submarines. And it was a miracle that none of the nuclear weapons on board ignited as a consequence. We cannot afford to continue to take these risks. Fortunately for us, despite the obduracy of the nuclear weapon states in the 20 years since the Cold War, we had four distinguished elder statesmen in the United States: George Shultz, who was Secretary of State under Reagan; Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State under Nixon; William Perry, Secretary of Defense under Clinton; and Sam Nunn, who was a senator chairing the Armed Services Committee. Four gentlemen who belonged to both the Democrat Party and the Republican Party teamed together under the aegis of the Hoover Institute in Stanford University in the West Coast of the United States and wrote an op-ed to the Wall Street Journal, which, as you know, is not the most progressive journal in the United States. And what they said in January 2007 was, in many ways, a political earthquake. Because here were these gentlemen, great cold warriors, great supporters of the nuclear deterrence theory, which was a religion at the time of the Cold War, now turning their back on the ownership of nuclear weapons and describing nuclear deterrence as being increasingly hazardous and decreasingly effective, and calling on a partnership in order to get rid of the nuclear weapons that will be deviling the world. Let me quote just one paragraph from their op-ed. Reassertion of the vision of a world free of nuclear weapons and practical measures towards achieving that goal would be perceived as a bold initiative consistent with America's moral heritage. The effort could have a profoundly positive impact on the security of future generations. Without the bold vision, the actions will not be perceived as fair or urgent. Without the actions, the vision will be perceived as realistic or possible. Fortunately for the international community, this repetition in 2007 and 2008 of a cry for the abolition of nuclear weapons, which Pugwash had consistently advocated throughout its existence and which other NGO organizations had similarly advocated, was taken up in the presidential election campaign of 2008. And both candidates, Senator McCain and Senator Obama, began to endorse the vision of a nuclear weapon-free world. And when Senator Obama was elected as president, shortly after his election in April 1st, he and Medvedev issued a statement in London committing themselves to replace the expiring START treaty with a new treaty which would undertake further cuts in their nuclear weapon arsenals. And 4 days later, in Prague, he made the historic speech in which he outlined what he wanted to do as far as nuclear weapons is concerned. And again, it is useful to remind ourselves of some of those things that were said. Let me quote, "The existence of thousands of nuclear weapons is the most dangerous legacy of the Cold War. No nuclear war was fought between the United States and the Soviet Union, but generations lived with the knowledge that their world could be erased in a single flash of light. Today, the Cold War has disappeared, but thousands of those weapons have not. in a strange turn of history, the threat of global nuclear war has gone down, but the risk of a nuclear attack has gone up. And so, ironically, the danger of nuclear weapons being used today is far greater than it was in the Cold War. But surprisingly, there is on the part of the general public a certain complacency with regard to nuclear weapons. During the Cold War, we had demonstrations in public. 1 million people marched in Central Park in 1982 in New York. We had campaigns against nuclear testing. We had campaigns for a nuclear freeze. But since the world has seen the ending of the Cold War, surprisingly, we all assume that nuclear weapons will never be used and that they may remain in the arsenals of not just the 5 countries who had it then, but the 9 countries who have it now, and possibly more will acquire it. Because the world cannot continue in its present state of having a separation between nuclear haves and have-nots. There will always be wannabes, people who want to acquire nuclear weapons, because it is the height of arrogance for countries to assume that only they can have nuclear weapons by a God-ordained right, and others can be prevented from having these weapons. Because there will always be countries aspiring to have nuclear weapons. And as the latest commission, the ICNND, co-sponsored by Australia and Japan, has said, so long as any state has nuclear weapons, others will want them. So long as any such weapons remain, it defies credibility that they will not one day be used by accident, miscalculation, or design. And any such use would be catastrophic. It is sheer luck that the world has escaped such catastrophe until now. And so we must, all of us, listen to the words of President Obama, which is that one nuclear weapon exploded in one city, be it New York or Moscow, Islamabad or Mumbai, Tokyo or Tel Aviv, Paris or Prague, could kill hundreds of thousands of people. And no matter where it happens, there is no end to what the consequences might be for our global safety, our security, our society, our economy, to our ultimate survival. Now, no doubt, President Obama, pragmatic politician that he is, seeing the Tea Party activists breathing down his neck and the Republican Party girding up its loins for the fall elections this year in the United States, has to restrain himself. And so he says, maybe this vision that I have of a nuclear weapon-free world may not take place in my lifetime. And he begins to qualify a lot of the things that he aspires to. But I believe his basic instinct is the right instinct. And it is up to us, the rest of the world, to support him in what he is doing. Within the year of his Prague speech, he has undertaken a number of achievements and completed them. And collectively, they are being called the Prague Spring. But my question is, will this Prague Spring blossom into a summer? And it is, I think, our responsibility as members of the international community, sharing that vision for getting rid of the most inhumane weapons invented by humankind, to have a nuclear weapon-free world, that we should support what he is doing. And here, addressing a Canadian audience of a country that is a NATO ally of the United States, apart from being a close neighbor, I believe it is important that whatever influence can be brought to bear on Republican senators in the United States to help in the ratification, firstly, of the New START Treaty, and secondly, of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban, would be efforts well invested. And indeed, it is your task to persuade your own government to engage in this attempt to persuade the Republican senators to act as they should in the interest of the international community. But more than that, we have seen in the record time of 1 year the negotiation of a follow-up treaty. It is true that the achievement of New START is a modest one. Some may regard it as a glass half empty. Some may think it is a glass half full. But we have got a return to the classic arms control and disarmament track from which the Bush-Cheney administration led us astray. Because there we did not have verifiable, irreversible agreement in the Treaty of Moscow. Now we do have a three-tiered treaty with very substantial on-site verification, a new counting rules with regard to the launchers, and a 30% reduction of strategic deployed warheads so that both sides will in future, after a 7-year period of implementation, have 1,550 nuclear warheads each. Now this may still be a huge lot of nuclear warheads, but it is a first step. And we have been promised by the Obama administration that after the ratification of the New START in the US Senate and in the Russian Duma, there will be further negotiations of deeper cuts in the arsenals of both these countries. At a certain stage, of course, we need to have this bilateral disarmament process joined by the other nuclear weapon states, France, UK, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, even though it is coy about the fact that it is a nuclear weapon state. And that, I think, is the best way for us to achieve the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. Because if there are eventually 0 weapons in the world, there can be no proliferation and there can be no nuclear terrorism. But not content with the achievement of the New START and its signature, we had the nuclear posture review of the United States come out in April. And it was in many ways qualitatively different from the earlier nuclear posture review of the Bush administration, which predicated an actual use of nuclear weapons, even as a reprisal of the use of biological or chemical weapons or even conventional weapons by non-nuclear weapon states. And it talked about new weaponry like the RRW, the reliable replacement weapon, which the US had planned to manufacture. But now, in the new nuclear posture review, we have a narrowing of the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons. We have a categorical assurance to non-nuclear weapon states who are in compliance with the NPT that they will not be attacked by the United States with nuclear weapons or threatened. And thirdly, we have an assurance that no new nuclear weapons will be manufactured. Yes, there will be the ability to stewardship programs in order to ensure that the deterrent of the US will remain reliable, but there will be no new nuclear weapons. And to that extent, I think the new nuclear posture review, even though the advances are not as much as I had wished to and as many of us in the disarmament community had hoped for, it is still a substantial advance. The third element in the Obama achievements in April was the Nuclear Security Summit, where 47 heads of state and heads of government were assembled in the capital of the United States in Washington and were able to agree to make commitments for the security of nuclear materials and nuclear facilities. This was, of course, important because that kind of high-level commitment is important. We have two major conventions. The convention which is administered by the International Atomic Energy Agency for the protection, the physical protection of nuclear materials and nuclear facilities, with an amendment in 2005 which significantly broadens the scope of the convention, and another convention on nuclear terrorism. Both of these have got to be universalized and observed by the international community in order to prevent terrorist groups from acquiring nuclear weapons, nuclear materials, and nuclear facilities. We already have a Security Council Resolution 1540, which is being implemented with the cooperation of the international community so that you minimize the risk of nuclear terrorism. But here again, there is concern in the international community about double standards, which have bedeviled the implementation of the nuclear norms that have been established. On the one hand, we have the Western countries being very agitated about the fact that Iran has not observed their safeguards obligations with the IAEA. And that is true, that Iran has enriched uranium, which is not prohibited under the NPT, but nevertheless has not reported it to the IAEA. And there are still a number of unanswered questions which the IAEA has with Iran. But Iran is nowhere near acquiring a nuclear weapon. And that is indeed the verdict of the intelligence, the national intelligence estimates of the United States and several other intelligence agencies. Forget the alarmist signals that you hear from Israel, because it is, of course, in Israel's interest to have a strike preemptively on Iran's nuclear facilities. But there is no evidence, and with the experience that we've had on the invasion of Iraq, where it was discovered that there were no weapons of mass destruction, it would be a very dangerous expedition on the part of the international community to try to go into Iran. Now contrast the attitude of the West on Iran with the way in which the outrage which followed the 1998 explosion of nuclear devices in India and Pakistan in 1998, with Security Council Resolution 1172, with sanctions being imposed on both those countries. A little over a decade thereafter, the United States was in an indecent hurry to sign a nuclear cooperation deal in order to provide India with nuclear material, despite the fact that that nuclear material was being denied to states who were non-nuclear weapon states within the NPT. This distinction between so-called good proliferators and bad proliferators is a slippery slope. It is also an example of how realpolitik triumphs and trumps non-proliferation principles. It's a violation of Article 1 of the NPT and Section 12 of the Principles and Objectives decision, which I negotiated under my presidency in 1995. And you cannot blame the United States alone, because Canada itself lost no time in negotiating our own deal with the Indians in order to supply them with nuclear material and nuclear facilities. Again, notwithstanding the fact that in 1974, Canada had been betrayed when India had its so-called peaceful nuclear test, which was the beginning of her nuclear weapon program. So, with that kind of conduct on the part of the nuclear weapon states, can you blame non-nuclear weapon states who want to break out of this treaty and wonder whether they are not being trapped inside a treaty with false promises, where they are not only being denied the benefits of a treaty that were promised to them, they are not only seeing the nuclear weapon states hanging on to their nuclear weapons despite the promise under Article 6 of getting rid of those nuclear weapons, which the International Court of Justice, in an advisory opinion, stated that they must do in an interpretation of that article. But they see, therefore, even more restrictions being demanded of them. In the run-up to the 8th Review Conference of the NPT, which is now going on in New York, there have been fresh demands that in addition to the safeguards agreements that the non-nuclear weapon states must sign with the IAEA in order to ensure that the peaceful uses of nuclear energy are not diverted to non-peaceful uses, they must also sign the additional model protocol. Now, left to themselves, the non-nuclear weapon states have voluntarily, 131 of them, have voluntarily signed the additional protocol, and it has come into force in the case of 98 of them. But when you tell them that they have to sign this, it's mandatory in order to get your peaceful uses of nuclear energy under Article 4, the non-nuclear weapon states react. And they say, to hell with you. Why should we do it? You are not accepting as nuclear weapon states any further requests or verification methods to ensure that you are getting rid of nuclear weapons. Why are you only imposing these on us one-sidedly? Another demand that is being made is that under Article 10, which is the withdrawal clause, the nuclear weapon states and their allies are trying to tell the non-nuclear weapon states, we should not allow people in the NPT to be able to exit so easily, given what the DPRK did. Now again, this is a violation of the sovereign right of countries to either join treaties freely or exit them if they think it is in their national interest so to do. Article 10 explains very clearly that if a country wants to leave the treaty because of its national interest, some people may say, well, we've been in this treaty for 40 years, the nuclear weapon states have not fulfilled Article 6, so why should we remain in it? Let us get out of it. We may not want to go nuclear ourselves, but we just don't think that this is a bargain worth continuing because it is one-sided, it is unequal, and it hasn't given us what we expected. But if you are prevented from leaving it against what the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties says, then it is a very serious threat. The United States can walk out of its bilateral ABM treaty signed with the old Soviet Union, but little Maldives or some other country is unable to leave the NPT without serious repercussions from the Security Council, which is controlled by the Big Five, who are all nuclear weapon states. So this is the kind of inequality, the fact that the playing field is not level and that there are double standards which incense the developing countries, the non-nuclear weapon states, in the non-aligned movement particularly. So we must therefore have a more level playing field, and that is what I think the non-aligned movement is attempting to do in its current negotiations in the 8th review conference that is going on today. Another major grievance amongst the non-aligned is the fact that in 1995, I negotiated a resolution on the Middle East, where it was agreed by everybody in a resolution co-sponsored by the depository states, the US, the United Kingdom, and Russia, that we would have practical steps introduced to achieve the objective of having a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. Now, everybody knows that Israel has a nuclear weapon arsenal of about 200 nuclear warheads. But everybody has tiptoed around this. There is a conspiracy of silence. We know that it was France who supplied the material and the facilities and the technology to Israel. There is recently newspaper reports that there are companies in the United States who are providing uranium to Israel. And yet, there is horror-stricken phrases about Iran enriching uranium when the Iranians say that they want to have peaceful uses of nuclear energy. When the Shah of Iran wanted to have peaceful uses of nuclear energy, this was encouraged by the United States. But when the Ayatollahs want to have peaceful uses of nuclear energy, this is, of course, not acceptable. And so we have again this burning sense of injustice on the part of a lot of countries in the Middle East. And what we need to do, therefore, this year, 15 years after the resolution was adopted, is to ensure that there are some basic steps. Nobody expects a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East overnight, but some credible steps to show that you are in good faith implementing a resolution that you yourself co-sponsored and accepted. Because believe me, as president of that conference, we would not have got the indefinite extension of the NPT, which is what the nuclear weapon states and their allies wanted, unless the Arabs cooperated, and they cooperated because of the adoption of the resolution on the Middle East, which was made an integral part of the package. Now, there are talks going on between Washington and Egypt and the other Arab countries, and I'm optimistic that some modest steps will be agreed upon at the end of the day so that we can have a successful final document emerge on the 28th of May when the 8th review conference ends. But mark you, the Arab countries, which did not all belong to the NPT in 1995 when the resolution on the Middle East was adopted. After the adoption of the resolution on the Middle East, they all joined the NPT, hopeful that through this membership of the NPT, they may achieve a world in which the region of the Middle East at least would be free of weapons of mass destruction. And today, the only country that remains outside the NPT in the Middle East is Israel. Now, a lot of people say that Israel will be the last country to give up its nuclear weapons because of an existential threat to them. But if the negotiations for a weapons of mass destruction free zone goes parallel to a peace process, and as you know, the proximity talks initiated by that great American diplomat, Senator Mitchell, has just begun. If it goes concurrently, there is a hope that we might have these two processes converge at some point of time. But we need to have the demonstration that both processes are working. And unless that happens, we are going to be faced with possibly more breakouts from the NPT in the Middle East. Another nuclear challenge because my subject is global nuclear challenges, is the whole problem of climate change. As you know, the 4 reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change proves, in my view, incontrovertibly, that climate change is caused by the action of human beings. And the use of fossil fuels cannot any longer be sustained. And in this, many countries are looking to the possibility of using nuclear energy as an alternative source of energy. It is not a choice that I would myself recommend to my own country, but I believe it is the sovereign right of countries to choose whether they use solar power, whether they use wind power, nuclear energy, or all the myriad other choices that modern science and technology has offered the international community. And so there is supposedly a renaissance, a nuclear renaissance, the second nuclear age that is being talked about. My friend Dr. Trevor Finlay in Ottawa has recently concluded a report in which he says that that so-called nuclear renaissance is overhyped, that there is in fact not so many countries who are all scrambling to acquire nuclear energy. But be that as it may, this demand for nuclear energy has sent an alarm around the Western industrialized world, who feel that there is no credible firewall between peaceful uses of nuclear energy and non-peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And they feel that there is going to be, as a consequence of this nuclear renaissance and more countries wanting nuclear energy for power purposes, a danger of nuclear weapon proliferation. Now, as all of us know, there are many countries who have reached the stage of nuclear capability. Japan is a country which could go nuclear weapon capable very soon because of its current nuclear power capability. The same is true of Sweden and many other non-nuclear weapon states. But when the developing countries want legitimately to have a source of power for their national economic development, there is a huge hue and cry. And there is a certain lack of credibility in this. We have had suddenly a plethora of proposals from the international community about having multilateralization of the fuel cycle, internationalizing a fuel bank so that countries who want to have nuclear material for their reactors could go to a bank and get it. Now, of course, some developing countries will decide that they would prefer to do that rather than going into the expense and running the risk of having their own national enrichment. And the United Arab Emirates is one example of that. They have decided that they don't want to go into the expense because a reactor costs about $10 billion. It will also take 10 years for it to be in gestation. So they have taken that choice. But Brazil and South Africa, two large countries in perfectly good standing in the NPT, say, why should we? Why should we allow our national economic development to be held ransom to receiving material from a bank whose governance might one day turn against us, might one day not like our faces and say, you look a little like Ahmadinejad, and we don't like you, therefore we won't give you these nuclear materials. And so they say we would like to develop our own enriched uranium for our reactors so that we are self-reliant. And we won't have to go on bended knees to you, make compromises on our foreign policy, etc., in order to get this material for our power needs, which will help to fuel the economic development plans which we have, which will give our people the standard of living that they deserve. And so this is a natural reaction of a lot of developing countries. And we are going to be faced with this dilemma as we face the demand for nuclear energy. And this is why I think we have to make the option of the internationalization of the fuel cycle a voluntary option for developing countries. So they are able, if they wish to develop their own national enrichment plans or go to a bank or go to a multilateral fuel cycle for the processing of their uranium or their plutonium. One of the good things that emerged from the Washington Security Summit was the agreement that we should discourage the use of highly enriched uranium for civilian nuclear energy. That is something that was long overdue, and I hope this is going to be implemented so that we reduce the danger of highly enriched uranium being diverted for non-peaceful uses. We must also try to discourage the use of plutonium. But there are a number of countries who are engaged in the reprocessing of plutonium. Japan is one of them, and being a friendly country with the United States, this is accepted. South Korea also would like to enter that reprocessing process, and the negotiations are going on between Washington and Seoul on this. Now, this is one of the global nuclear challenges that we have. But fortunately, together with all these problems and challenges that we face, there is a groundswell of global opinion demanding that we go to global zero. Many of you may have heard of the global zero movement, and I am a member of that. We went to Paris on 2 occasions when a number of very distinguished leaders of the world, retired military officials and statesmen are all members of it. George Shultz was present, Queen Noor of Jordan, Jimmy Carter, and several others have all lent their name to a Global Zero Action Plan that was adopted in February 2010. And this plan talks about 4 phases in which incrementally we move down to the zero option, which will finally be achieved in 2030. And the way in which the Global Zero Summit was conducted was that from 2010 to 2013, following the conclusion of New START that we have just seen signed, there would be another bilateral accord for the US and Russia to reduce to 1,000 total warheads each to be implemented by 2018. And then from 2014 to 2018, there will be the next phase, where there will be a reduction to 500 warheads each. The third phase will be from 2019 to 2023, when a global zero accord will be negotiated with a legally binding international agreement signed by all nuclear-capable countries in a phased, verified, proportionate reduction of all nuclear arsenals to zero warheads by 2030. And in the period, the final phase, 2024 to 2030, there will be a completion of this dismantlement of all nuclear weapons and the continuation of a comprehensive verification and enforcement system prohibiting the development and the possession of nuclear weapons. Now, you might say, as Margaret Thatcher once did, that this is a pie in the sky. But let me remind you that what were once regarded as pies in the sky became concrete achievements in international politics. When I grew up in Sri Lanka, which was then a British colony, we achieved independence in 1948, which was at that time unthinkable. Of course, we were fortunate that Indian leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru led the freedom struggle in the subcontinent, and we were able to piggyback on their achievements in order to achieve our freedom. There was a time when the apartheid system in South Africa was regarded as immutable, and a white minority racist regime was able to rule over the majority of blacks. And Nelson Mandela was imprisoned in Robben Island for 27 years. But he finally emerged a free man and transformed South Africa into a non-racial democracy, which even gave up the 7 nuclear devices that it had clandestinely developed, destroyed under the supervision of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So we have scaled many mountains in international relations. And to say that nuclear weapons will never be got rid of, I think, is defeatism. And indeed, that defeatism was also mentioned by President Obama in his Prague speech, when he said very eloquently that some argue that the spread of these weapons cannot be stopped, cannot be checked, that we are destined to live in a world where more nations and more people possess the ultimate tools of destruction. Such fatalism is a deadly adversary. For if we believe that the spread of nuclear weapons is inevitable, then in some way we are admitting to ourselves that the use of nuclear weapons is inevitable. And so I think that it is our combined task as members of the international community to join together in the global movement for zero nuclear weapons. There is today a fresh demand for a nuclear weapons convention. And one of my tasks this afternoon was to address a group of very eminent Canadians who have all been recipients of the Order of Canada, the creme de la creme of Canadian society, 505 of whom have submitted a petition to their government calling for a nuclear weapons convention. I had the privilege of being present in New York when my friend of 25 years standing, Senator Douglas Roach, a veteran Pugwashite and a great campaigner for peace and disarmament, presented this petition to the president of the 8th NPT Review Conference, to great applause from the NGO community and the diplomatic corps who had assembled there. And so with groups like the Order of Canada recipients and others joining this international movement for a nuclear weapons convention, which the Secretary-General of the United Nations himself has included in his 5-point plan for nuclear disarmament, I hope that we can prevail upon the nuclear weapon states to begin negotiating this plan. We know, as I said before, that nuclear weapons are the most inhumane weapons ever conceived, inherently indiscriminate in those they kill and maim, and with an impact deadly for decades because of its radiation effects, which can destroy the ecology which sustains human life and which can continue to cause long-standing genetic effects, which affects the future of humankind. They are the only weapons ever invented that have the capacity to wholly destroy life on this planet. And the arsenals we now possess are ready to do so many times over. So the problems of nuclear weapons is similar to the problem of climate change in terms of gravity, and they are both, as I have pointed out earlier, interconnected. I think maintaining the status quo, as the Gareth Evans Kawaguchi report says, is not an option. And so we must, all of us, again, as I say, look to the total elimination of nuclear weapons, which is the only answer to the problem of nuclear proliferation and the problem of nuclear terrorism. We face very critical days in New York as the 8th Review Conference continues for the next 3 weeks. We know that review conferences, 4 of them have ended successfully with the adoption of a consensus document. 3 of them have failed. But the mere papering over of cracks with clever diplomatic phraseology and the compromises that are reached is not only enough. We have to have credible assurances that the nuclear weapon states will give up their weapons, that they will, as they did in 2000, unequivocally undertake to move towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons. We know that France would like to qualify the words of President Obama with regard to a vision of a nuclear weapon-free world, and they have already done so in Council Resolution 1887. And in the P5 statement that was issued last week, the language that appeared to be less than unequivocal is attributed to French reservations about giving up their nuclear weapons. We need to have pressure mounted. We need to have even boycotts of goods from these countries if they do not cooperate with what the people of the world want. And so we need to see optimum results, strengthening the non-proliferation norm so that Iran is in no doubt that we mean serious business when we want them to abide by IAEA requirements, that Syria is in no doubt of the same, but at the same time, that the nuclear weapon states also realize that the longer they hold on to their nuclear weapons, there will be countries who will want to acquire the same weapons for the same so-called security, which we know, in fact, is not going to be the answer to the security needs of the world. So let me stop there and hope that I have provoked some discussion on these various issues, which are issues that are not academic. They are not issues that only seize the diplomats of the world who go in their gray flannel suits up and down the aisles of the United Nations, but are life and death issues that affect every human being living in this world, because we do not realize how vulnerable we are to being destroyed by nuclear weapons. As I said before, either by accident or by design, by a nuclear weapon state or by non-state actors. Thank you.
Good evening, sir.
Yes.
It's a beautiful lecture for all of us. We are here. My question to you, 2 things. 1, the invasion of Iraq, the American used depleted uranium. Is the NPT included in this treaty? The depleted uranium.
I couldn't get you.
My question is
The acoustics are not very good.
Pardon?
Lower it.
It works? Yeah, okay. Is the depleted uranium including in the Non-Proliferation Treaty?
No, it is not. And I understand your concern about depleted uranium.
But
Because-
The occupation of Iraq is used all depleted uranium, and they have the longest effect in that land. And how they can trust American for these purposes? I have another question. Can I? Is the international treaty have covered the waste too? The waste material or uranium material, is it covered by this treaty?
Waste? No. Again, there is no provision in the terms of the NPT for the disposal of waste. That is an undertaking which each country which has nuclear energy for power purposes must undertake itself. Now, various countries have various proposals, mostly to bury it, but of course we know that burial itself can cause long-standing harm to aquifers and to the soil. Some have tried to dump it on the coasts of other countries, and that has led to huge international protest. But there has never been a foolproof methodology that has been developed to denature the nuclear waste. But that is one of the risks of using nuclear energy for power purposes. And that is why, as I said, for my own country, I would not recommend nuclear energy.
Is anybody else? Is there only one? Yeah. Well, maybe this is the last one. You mention always the climate change. What about the health of the planet? You never mentioned in your lecture, sir. The public health of the planet, sir.
Yes. Of course. I mean, when you are dead, of course, it's not a question as to how healthy you are. But I have met Hibakusha who are still suffering the after effects of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and one of them spoke very eloquently last Friday at the NPT review conference. And so certainly there are long-term effects for those who are lucky enough to survive a nuclear bomb blast, because the radiation will give them permanent effects, cancers and so on, and that has always been recorded. We have had UN studies done about that, which prove very, very conclusively the harmful health effects for those survivors of a nuclear bomb attack. Now, if I may go back to the question of depleted uranium, I know about the allegations about the use of depleted uranium.
This is a fact in the United Nations, not is a fact, sir.
Yes, but I endeavored to have this matter investigated when I was Undersecretary-General by the World Health Organization, by the UN Environmental Program, and to try to find evidence of actual harmful effects of this depleted uranium, because there was evidence that was produced at some stage about the Gulf sickness syndrome being caused by depleted uranium. But I must say that I was not able to obtain from these organizations, which were more competent than my Department for Disarmament Affairs, to find scientific evidence to prove that there was a causal connection between the use of depleted uranium and any kind of illnesses of the soldiers, both Western soldiers, American soldiers who fought in the Iraq War, and Iraqis themselves. Although I have seen a lot of material on this. So until such time as we have some kind of a commission of inquiry with scientific evidence, and this is something that a lot of organizations with the scientific capability should be able to undertake in order to prove conclusively that there is in fact this causal connection.
Well, I can't dispute with you, but the medical journal, the popular one, the Lancet, the new medical journal, approved that the depleted uranium in Iraqi soil caused so much genetic the VIX. Thank you.
Thank you.
My question concerns the nuclear weapon states who are outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I wonder in what way they are represented at the UN negotiations right now. Do they have observers? Is anyone working toward trying to get them into the treaty? What is the status?
India is certainly never been represented at the NPT review conferences and has always regarded the NPT as untouchable. But Pakistan and Israel have sometimes come to these meetings as observers. They do not speak, but they observe. I am not sure that they are present at this 8th review conference. I have not seen the full list of participants as yet. But that is, of course, not the point. The point is that it would be impossible for these 3 countries to enter the NPT as nuclear weapon states, because the current rule is that they should have become nuclear weapon states before a certain date, and they do not qualify by that standard. Any attempt to change that rule will be met by an overwhelmingly hostile reaction by the non-nuclear weapon states. So that is out. Now, the new Gareth Evans Kawaguchi Commission report recommends having some parallel agreements like the CTBT, the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, which could enlist their participation and get them to observe some of the requirements that we get the nuclear weapon states to meet under the NPT. But that is only a partial way of bringing them in. I think any effort on the part of the nuclear weapon states within the treaty to confer the status of nuclear weapon state on these countries will be met with a very hostile reaction, as indeed the decision of the US to give nuclear material to India has excited a great deal of opposition from non-nuclear weapon states in the NPT. And one hopes that in this review conference, a block will be placed on future concessions, because I can tell you there is a lot of pressure by Pakistan to get the same facilities that India has got. And when the delegation from Pakistan came to Washington in April of this year, there was intense pressure brought to bear on the US government to give them precisely that. Fortunately, that was averted. Now, if the same thing happens with Israel, I can tell you the 21 Arab states will walk out of the NPT, and that will be the collapse of the NPT.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk, Ambassador. I have a question about the NPT review conference that's going on right now in New York and will go on for the rest of May, and about your take on what might constitute a success at the end of this NPT review conference. Some people may be aware the last NPT review conference was generally considered a failure for the lack of consensus in the end. For this year, if you were to be cautiously optimistic, what would you say would be a measure of success?
Well, the measure of success will be the adoption of a final document by consensus. And the elements that will go into that final document will be basically a strong reaffirmation of the fundamental principles underlying the treaty in the 3 pillars of non-proliferation, disarmament, and peaceful uses of nuclear energy. There has to be, in Article 1, I think, a reaffirmation of the principle of non-proliferation without actually naming Iran, because if you try to name Iran, you're going to have a huge uproar from the Iranians, and that will be the end of the adoption of a consensus document. But I think it is possible to talk about this. It is also possible, as I hope will be done, that without again referring specifically to the Indo-US Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, to rule out any further exceptions to the rule that non-NPT parties will get these facilities that were given to the Indians. On Article 6, we have to have something similar to the 2000 final document, the unequivocal undertaking of the nuclear weapon states for the total elimination of nuclear weapons, something similar to the 13 steps that were agreed upon in 2000. There are people who talk about 20 steps, there are people who talk about other ways. We have many recipes floating around. Pugwash also came out with a Milan document after our January conference. So these will be discussed and negotiated. And there is today the same grouping called the New Agenda Coalition, 7 countries who were very active in 2000 and who were able to negotiate very forcefully with the nuclear weapon states and achieve that successful agreement on the 13 steps. They are once again active. On the resolution on the Middle East, we have to have certain steps taken, and again, the prospect seems to be good after the first week. I hope it will be successful. There are also countries, including Canada, who would like to strengthen the administrative machinery of the NPT because people feel there is a deficiency, a deficit with regard to its organizational capacity to discuss things amongst the parties to the NPT. All this, I think, will help. And of course, if language can be found to encourage countries without making it mandatory to sign the additional protocol, to encourage countries to remain within the NPT and to have language that will frown on countries who want to leave the NPT with the benefits that they have accrued, which I think is a legitimate demand of all state parties. So I think on those lines, if we can have a final document, we would have a success.
Thank you. Just to follow up, are you optimistic about an explicit mention of a nuclear weapons convention or preparatory work for a nuclear weapons convention?
Well, there are a lot of non-nuclear weapon states who want that. The United States has already said that they would be prepared to look for a vision of a nuclear weapon-free world, not within the context of a nuclear weapons convention. So unless it is obliquely worded, I can't see the United States agreeing to the mention of a nuclear weapon convention or committing themselves to a preparatory process.
Ambassador, thank you for an eloquent plea for a nuclear-free, can you hear me? For a nuclear-free world, and I love the dream of 2030 as the sort of the end point. But frankly, I'm a bit of a skeptic about UN resolutions and PT review conferences, so I should declare my bias right away. The way I see it, that the NPT was itself created in a very particular global context. That was the Cold War days, and the Americans and the Russians were the principals at that time, and so it was important to have that agreement. And the whole idea was to draw the line. Can you hear me?
Yes.
To draw the line at the 6th nuclear weapon state. If you recall the discussions of the mid-60s, that was the framework. Now, as we all know, it's gone way beyond 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and then 2 of the parties in the NPT itself, Iran and North Korea, are seen as outside the discipline of the NPT system. Now, my question to you is that the nuclear debate seems to have gone beyond the NPT. So even though the non-proliferation norm is very much in play, but the provisions of the NPT, say Article 6 and things like that, or Article 1, that thou shalt not provide nuclear assistance, the world has gone way beyond. For instance, in 1982, Deng Xiaoping himself personally authorized the transfer of sensitive nuclear technology to Pakistan. Now, this has been documented. Now, in such cases, when a P5 country is involved itself in that exercise, the debate really is not about the provisions of the NPT, it's really about how to negotiate a settlement with the North Koreans and the Iranians and others. In other words, I'm pointing to the emergence of a political debate where the approach is not multilateral in terms of international, but the approach is regional, 6 countries involved with North Korea, 6 with Iran. So in this case, the framework of negotiations has gone beyond. So in this case, I'm wondering if NPT diplomacy is the way to go. I'm not saying throw it out, I'm just saying put it in context. Sorry I took so long.
Well, first of all, nobody says that the NPT is a perfect treaty. It has many imperfections like all humanly drafted treaties and documents. And as I said myself, it's an unequal treaty. The central bargain is an asymmetrical bargain. The non-nuclear weapon states are expected to maintain non-nuclear weapon status, undergoing stringent safeguards which act as a verification measure. The nuclear weapon states are a separate caste, an upper caste, which is not expected to subject themselves to any verification with regard to their obligations. And so this tension has continued for a very long time. But if you, for example, talk about what China did, and indeed what France did vis-à-vis Israel, these actions took place before both those countries actually joined the NPT, because as you know, it was only in the 1990s that France and China joined the NPT as nuclear weapon states. That is not to excuse their behavior. It is also not to excuse the behavior also of Pakistan, whose AQ Khan network engaged in a huge black market enterprise which supplied nuclear weapon technology and materials to many countries in the world, and which was finally exposed. But the kind of punishment meted out to AQ Khan is certainly not commensurate with the enormity of his crime. But at the same time, I think it is fair to say that the norm established by the NPT remains a very important one, because one of the arguments that the United States made for justifying the nuclear cooperation deal with India was the fact that India had been consistently a country that had observed non-proliferation. It had not behaved the way that France did vis-à-vis Israel or China did vis-à-vis Pakistan. And so the fact that this norm still matters internationally, I think, is a tribute to the NPT. It is also a tribute to the NPT that President John F. Kennedy visualized a world when he spoke in the 1960s, that by 1975 he expected there to be 25 nuclear weapon states. Now, if you look at the history of the world, we have had breakouts from the 5 original nuclear weapon states that existed when the NPT was signed in 1968 and when it entered into force in 1970, to 9 today. And there is no evidence that Iran today has actual nuclear weapons. Indeed, the national intelligence estimates of the United States and of many other intelligence agencies that they are perhaps developing a capability but are not there yet. And there is no smoking gun that anybody can point to. So I think it is to some credit that this barrier has even imperfectly held to a large extent without the kind of proliferation that was anticipated at a certain point of time. Of course, the world will be a safer place if we had no nuclear weapon states. But 9 is 9 too many, but it's not as bad as 25.
Sorry, one last question. More on the energy side of things. Being a person that has worked on nuclear disarmament, what would you consider would be the consequences if there was a real surge in the adoption of nuclear technology for producing energy? Yes.
Well, if it was done under strict safeguards, I think there would be risks of accidents like Chernobyl. But if safeguards were there and perfect arrangements are made to prevent these accidents, then I think there would be, of course, improvement. At the moment, the world has only 15%, 15% of its energy needs served by nuclear energy. So it's a big jump from there. Of course, in France, I think it's 70% of its energy needs are fulfilled by nuclear sources. And in Japan also, a fairly high percentage. So many countries have chosen not to. But Sweden, after many years of rejecting nuclear energy as a source of energy, are now going back to reconsidering it. So there are different choices that countries have to make, and if they have got systems in place to ensure the safety and the security of their nuclear facilities and nuclear materials, then I say good luck to them. Okay.
Okay. Well, I think we can all agree that that was an extremely powerful address and a call to arms to really address one of the key issues and challenges of our time, and one I think that we should all heed. So I'd ask you to join me in paying tribute to Ambassador Dhanapala, not just for a wonderful address, but also for his career of service in addressing such a critical issue to our collective humanity. So thank you very much, if you can join me. And this is just a token of our gratitude.